Today on the Jacob Beer Show, I'm so happy to have on Susan Ford Bales. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Jacob. How are you?
Good. And for some of our guests, this is Susan Ford Bales, who is the daughter of President Gerald Ford, um, who was president about 40 years ago for some of the younger people who might not study history as much, but we have on a lot of different guests so you can learn about those things. So I'm happy to have you on today.
Thank you, Jacob. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, my first question is what was it like kind of being raised, growing up in a political family, and then living in the White House, being a teenager? I'm 17. You were my age living in the White House. What was that kind of like? It had to have been pretty crazy, fun, and, also crazy at the same time.
No, it was, but I had grown up in Washington my entire life. So my dad was a congressman from the time I was born. So that just being in Washington and being in a political family throws you some different curves, shall we say. But I was used to it. I grew up with other congressional kids and we're friends with them. So, in that sense, that's kind of what happens in Washington. Not anymore, but that was back in the day, back in the 70s. And then my dad became vice president, and that was a short lived assignment, whatever you want to call it.
About a year, if I'm correct, 11 months.
11 months, you're about right. Yeah. And then he became president. And so, literally that night we were informed that we were moving to the White House, but it was about 10 days before we moved to the White House because they had to move the Nixon's things out before we could move in as a family. So my dad commuted from Alexandria, Virginia, where I grew up, for about 10 days until we moved in.
Wow. And then what was it like, going to school? Of course, there's a lot of presidents' kids that have gone to kind of the same school. What is that experience like? I've heard some people say, a lot of kids who go to that school, they're the son or daughter of a senator, so it isn't so much like, wow, you're the president's daughter. What was that
Um,
experience kind of like?
well, I mean, the thing is, I started off at Holton Arms School in Bethesda, Maryland, as a freshman. And that was because of the busing in Alexandria, Virginia. If any of you have ever seen the movie Remembering the Titans, where Denzel Washington plays one of the coaches, Alexandria school system started a big busing program, and my brothers came home and said, "You can't send Susan to public school," which is where I had gone to school up until then. So I transferred to a private girls' school in Bethesda and was a boarder. But when my dad became vice president and I got Secret Service protection, I had to move out of the dorm and back home. And then I commuted back and forth to Holton Arms every day. It was about a 40-minute drive.
Wow. So then what was
But
it?
I mean, I put on my uniform and curled up in the back seat of the car and slept. I mean, just like,
A normal
most
kid.
a normal kid. Um, but living in the White House was very different. To me, I had grown up, sharing a bathroom with three brothers. We lived in a pretty simple salt box house. And my parents had their own bedroom and bathroom, but all of the guest rooms back then, you shared one bathroom. So the best bonus to me was I got my own bathroom at the White House and I didn't have to share it with my brothers. But it was fun. We had a bowling alley, we had a movie theater, all of those things. But my life pretty much stayed the same. I got up, went to class every morning. By this point, I'm now a senior in high school when my dad became president. Um, Went to class all day, got back in the car and went back to the White House. And before my parents would let me do any of the functions or participate, it was you got to get your homework done. And that was the number one priority.
Wow. Seems like any good parent. So
Yes, that's what we're all supposed to do, right?
absolutely. And of course, what now, if you don't mind me asking, what room in the White House was your favorite? And did you ever sleep in the Lincoln bedroom? Or, did you sleep in a room that had some kind of history? Every room has history. Like, what room was it, if you can recall?
Well, my bedroom was up on the third floor.
which most people can't see, but there is a third floor there.
There is a third floor. It's behind those little pillars at the top. My bedroom was on the north side of the White House, so I could hear the demonstrators outside, which were the Vietnam War demonstrators. And then my, I guess my favorite room. There are a lot of really exceptional rooms in the White House, but it would be the state floor, which is where the red room, the green room, the blue room, and the dining room and the east room, which are the public rooms. So if you ever go on a tour of the White House, those are the rooms that you would see. But they're just so elegant and beautiful. And, when I look at what Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Nixon and all of those women did to bring back the original furnishings that were there before, the house got burned and everything else. The White House has come a long way, and I still do a lot of events and things with the White House Historical Association.
Awesome. And one last thing, Mom, just on the topic of this before I kind of go into ask some questions about your father's legacy is what after, of course, you left office and things like that, you went on to college, if I'm correct. What is it like, when people like perhaps Chelsea Clinton as a teenager moved in, or the Obama kids, did you have any type of relation with, giving them any advice or things like that over the years when other first families would come in or kids of well-known politicians? Did you have anything to do with that potentially?
That's kind of one of those things. Amy Carter followed me. She went to Washington Public Schools. I had no contact with Amy. I have met Chelsea Clinton. And it's the sad thing is normally when we are together, it's usually because it's a funeral. I'm probably closer to the Johnson girls because they were just a little bit older than me. I know Patricia Nixon Cox. So it's kind of, and I've met the Bush girls.
You did an
So
interview with one that I really liked. That was a very good interview.
yeah, so I mean, it all depends. When my dad or mother, I have to think about this, received the Presidential Gold Medal, we got to go back to the White House. Bush 41 was president then. And Mrs. Bush let us go up into the family quarters to see the house because I had not been upstairs. It's unusual that you are allowed to go back upstairs into the rooms that you got to live in.
Interesting.
So it's every administration does it differently, and that's their right and that's their choice. And so it was a real pleasure that President and Mrs. Bush allowed us to go up to the third floor and I could see my bedroom.
Awesome. I guess, that kind of makes it just like anything, it'd be like me going back to Ohio and maybe the neighbors would let me in, maybe they wouldn't, no difference there just because it's the White House, it's still someone else's living quarters at the moment, that's
Right.
actually
And my freshman year of college, I lived in the house and commuted because I went to a small women's college in Washington. And then my sophomore year, I transferred and went into a townhouse with a bunch of girlfriends because I wanted to experience what college was like. And then I
absolutely
transferred from there to the University of Kansas and never finished, which was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made.
interesting. Are you a Jayhawks fan?
I am, but they're out of the March
Yep.
Madness right now, so that's not good.
And so is Michigan, where your father played football and won a title. So,
Right, they ended up in the NIT,
yep, and
but
then lost to Vandy.
I know, which is hard for me to handle.
So now I don't want to, of course, just base this entire interview off of the White House because there's many unique things. Your father, of course, interesting how he became president, what legacy would you say he'd want to be known as, leaving behind? Of course, there's so many different things when you look at it, but a lot of people say now in today's world, they're like, kind of looking back on history, Trump, Biden, Obama. I would take a Gerald Ford presidency at the moment right now. Is what I've heard people say to me.
Well, and I think you're right because that's what people say to me also. where's your dad now? And I'm like, well, sorry, I can't help you on that. But, my dad's legacy was all about integrity. And he was a president who reached across the aisles. But you have to remember, he had been in Congress for 25 years. So he knew both parties. He knew both parties well. The only job he ever wanted was to be Speaker of the House, which he never got to do. It was the 25th Amendment of our Constitution, which allowed him to become Vice President. So he had a lot of unique things that happened to him that have never happened since to this day. It's but his was all about integrity and working together. My dad was an incredible listener. And if you look at his cabinet and you look at the people that work for him, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Alan Greenspan, all of those people, he got the best, and he always listened to what they had to say before he made his decision on policy.
Absolutely. And of course, a lot of them went on to do some pretty historic things, like Dick Cheney, who became vice president, was the deputy chief of staff. Donald Rumsfeld, who went on to serve under some other administrations.
Right.
And a lot of the Reagan alumni, even, who came
Right.
from the Ford administration before. So,
Right.
things like that. And then your mom, of course, her story was very unique about how she was diagnosed with cancer at 6 weeks in, if I'm correct. And she was an advocate as well, for women's rights, which few people, don't know, because, Ford was a Republican and she kind of had a liberal sense. What was that kind of like, seeing her advocate for things over the years?
Well, I will always be proud of her for being so outspoken. And, one of the promises that my parents made to the American public was honesty. And so when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, which back in 1974, you couldn't say breast on TV. And so she really broke that ceiling and came out and talked about her experience and her mastectomy and everything else. So I'm really proud of her for that. But she also spoke out about Equal Rights Amendment. It's pretty shocking today that it still hasn't passed. And I don't get that. I think she would be mortified that we still don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. Everything else is, equal this, equal that, but we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. So that's disappointing, I think.
Interesting. And then, of course, I'd like to focus on you again. You've, in some ways, done some things for mental health advocating, which I think is important, especially for teenagers. The suicide rate is alarming. Depression is alarming. What advice, would you say from your research and things like that, would you have for people, when it comes to mental health? That maybe...
Well, first, I mean, it gets back to being open and honest and telling the truth. But I sit on the board of the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation, and which treats substance use disorder, which has to do with mental health. The majority, I would say, of our patients have a mental health component to their substance use disorder. And so mental health is extremely important. And you've got to work with the two of them side by side to help each other out. And I mean, my mother talked about her mental health back in the day, and we've come a long way, but we have a long road ahead of us still.
And what would you kind of, I guess, suggest for teenagers who might be going through a tough time trying to find themselves? What advice would you kind of have on that part of it? And the reason why I ask that is because a lot of teenagers and college kids ask that, and being in college can be stressful, or being in high school, not having friends, things like that.
Well, and I have, my children are now grown, but I now have a 16-year-old granddaughter and a 13-year-old grandson, and then 3 other grandchildren. And so I've watched them having to manage this. And, the thing is, there are 800 numbers, use them. At the same time, get help. Sitting in a closet and hiding your disease, if it's mental illness, isn't going to change anything. And it's, people need to get out and do something about it and get help, because things aren't going to change unless you get help.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the advice, and I hope people will, like you said, I think that's such a big thing, and you can't say it enough, literally, is get out and get help, don't hide it. So,
Well,
hopefully
I
that
mean, I have friends that are school guidance counselors. I mean, there is help out there all over the place, but no one can come find you. You're the one who has to make that first step and step forward.
just like getting a job, it's rare that people are going to call you for a job. You got to go out there and apply yourself to that. So kind of the same thing if you need a counselor, they're out there, reach out to them, They're not
Yep.
going to find you because there's 1,200 kids at a high school potentially, but they are there,
Yep.
There's I know at my high school there used to be like one counselor, now there's three. Granted they all kind of do different things, but like you said, they're out there and there's help. So get the help. And there's a lot in the professional field too that we're seeing grow.
Right.
So lots of good things on that. And then kind of one last question I have is, would you ever consider potentially running for office?
Heavens, no.
I had to ask that, because
I know, but heavens no. I gave my dad up for 25 years when he was in Congress and president and vice president and was away from the family and that sort of thing. There are other ways to change the world, and hopefully it's my volunteer work with breast cancer and substance use disorder to make changes. But the political world is a hard world to live in. There, people are so judgmental and quick to judge.
interesting. Well, I appreciate you coming on the Jacob Buer show today. Do you have any maybe last little stories you want to share that you have from a White House memory as well?
Well, since you're dealing with high school kids, I am the only, to this date, person to have ever had a senior prom at the White House, and it was a very, very special night, and I felt very privileged and lucky to have been able to do that for my class.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Speaking of prom, our tickets go on sale this week at our school for that. I appreciate you coming on the Jacob Buer show today.
Thanks, Jacob.